I still remember the beeping of the monitors, the cold sting of the IV, and the sound of my mother's voice saying, "We just can't afford it." Not because there wasn't money, but because that money had already been promised to my younger sister's college fund. I was 15. I had just been told I needed urgent treatment to survive. And my parents chose not to sign the forms. They didn't cry. They didn't hesitate. They said, "God will provide," and walked out of the hospital room like it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was my life. Luckily, my grandmother showed up. She didn't ask questions. She just acted. And because of her, I'm alive. But I didn't stay silent. I did something quietly, carefully, and deliberately. And years later, my parents regretted their choice more than I could have ever imagined. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday. I was lying on a thin hospital bed, the fluorescent lights buzzing above me, when the doctor walked in and said the words, "I'll never forget. It's serious. You'll need treatment immediately if we want a real shot at recovery." For a few seconds, I felt the world fall away. I was scared, but a part of me naive, hopeful thought, "It's okay. My parents are here. They'll take care of me." They stood at the foot of the bed. My dad stared at the floor. My mom folded her arms tightly across her chest. The doctor continued. He mentioned the treatment plan, the success rate, and finally, the cost. That's when my mother spoke. "We won't be moving forward." I blinked, thinking I'd misheard her. "I'm sorry," I croaked, my voice raw. She sighed. "We've talked about this, Madeline. Isabel's college tuition is already locked in. The treatment, it's just too much. We can't sacrifice her future." My heart dropped. I could die. Dad didn't say anything. He just gave a small shrug, like it wasn't his decision to make. "We believe that if it's meant to be, it will be," my mom added. "God has a plan." I remember gripping the side of the bed so hard my knuckles turned white. It wasn't even anger that hit me first. It was confusion. Were they serious? Were they really putting Isabel's future ahead of my life? They didn't cry. They didn't hold my hand. They didn't even say goodbye. They just turned and walked out of the room. A nurse came in a few minutes later. "Are your parents coming back?" she asked gently. I didn't answer. I didn't know what to say. I stared at the door for what felt like hours. My body was still weak, but I felt something ignite inside me. A quiet heat, a clarity I'd never felt before. They're not coming back. They had made their choice. They chose Isabel, the star, the girl who'd never had to ask twice, the daughter who got private lessons, spring trips, and sparkling new laptops. Me? I was the background, the burden. I had always felt I'd at birthday parties when my gifts were an afterthought, in the silence when I brought home awards, and no one noticed, but now it was confirmed. And yet, I was still here. Still breathing. Still alive, if only barely. And if they weren't going to fight for me, then I would have to fight for myself. Alone? That night, as the machines around me beeped steadily, I closed my eyes and whispered one promise to myself. This isn't the end. It's the beginning. The next morning, the nurses looked at me differently. Sympathetic glances. Forced smiles. They'd heard. A social worker came in with a clipboard, her tone polite but clinical. She asked about guardianship, emergency contacts, medical proxies. I just stared at her blankly. "My parents aren't coming back," I said, my voice hollow. She hesitated. "Do you have anyone else? An aunt? Grandparent?" I did, but I hadn't spoken to her in almost a year. Grandma Rosemary, my mom's mother. She lived in a quiet little house across town. She wasn't someone they talked about much anymore, mostly because she didn't approve of the way my parents raised us. I remembered once, during a Christmas dinner, she pulled me aside and whispered, "You deserve more love than they know how to give." I never forgot that. So I gave the social worker her name and number. An hour later, my room phone rang. "Madeline?" The voice was breathless, panicked. "Grandma?" Sweetheart, I'm on my way. 15 minutes later, the door flew open. She wasn't tall or strong or loud, but in that moment, she looked like a warrior. Her gray curls frizzed from the wind, her cardigan misbuttoned, her eyes glistening behind thin glasses. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She saw the IV, the pale skin, the absence of parents. That was enough. She crossed the room, took my hand, and simply said, "I'm here now." I don't remember crying. I just remember feeling seen. Later that day, while doctors explained treatment options, she sat beside me and nodded. "What's the next step?" she asked. No hesitation. No flinching. When they mentioned the cost, she didn't blink. "We'll figure it out," she said. And I believed her. Because unlike my parents, she didn't calculate my worth on a spreadsheet. She didn't weigh my survival against someone else's future. She just loved me. That night, after the paperwork was signed and the first phase of treatment scheduled, she brought me a bag filled with pajamas, a lavender blanket, and a tiny music box I'd once loved as a kid. She'd kept it all those years. We sat in silence, the lullaby tune filling the quiet corners of the hospital room. She told me stories from when I was little, how I used to dance on her toes in the kitchen, how I once tried to plant jelly beans in her garden to grow a candy tree. I smiled for the first time in days. It was strange how something as simple as being remembered could stitch broken parts back together. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know how long I'd be in the hospital, or what recovery would look like. But I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't alone anymore. And that changed everything. After a few more days in the hospital, I was discharged with strict instructions and a folder full of medication plans, follow-up dates, and dietary restrictions. Grandma Rosemary drove me home in a car that smelled like mint gum and old books. She kept one hand on the steering wheel, the other occasionally reaching out to squeeze mine, like she was checking to make sure I was still really there. Her house was small, a faded yellow one-story with creaky floors and ivy crawling up one side. But to me, it felt like a castle. It was the first place I'd arrived in years where no one sighed when they saw me walk in. She set me up in the guest room, clean sheets, soft pillows, a chipped lamp with warm light. There was a note taped to the mirror that just said, "You are safe. You are wanted." I cried when I read it. Not loud, not messy, just quiet, exhausted tears. Grandma didn't ask questions the first few days. She focused on keeping me warm, fed, and rested. Every morning, she made me oatmeal with cinnamon. Every evening, she sat nearby and read while I drifted off to sleep. One afternoon, as I sat wrapped in a blanket on the porch, she brought out her laptop and a worn notebook. "I've been researching clinics," she said. "I'm talking to foundations, local health, nonprofits, anyone who'll listen. We'll figure out a way to cover the rest." I stared at her. "You're doing all this? For me?" She smiled. "Of course I am." And then she said something I didn't know I needed to hear. "You're not a burden, Madeline. You're my granddaughter. That's enough." That sentence landed like sunlight in a dark room. Because for so long, I'd been trained to measure my worth by comparison to Isabel's grades, her charm, her future potential. In our family, she was the investment, I was the expense. But here, with Grandma, I was just me, and somehow, that was okay. In the quiet of those early weeks, my body began to heal. Slowly, my appetite returned. I could sit up longer. I started walking around the block, one hand on the railing, the other clutching my grandma's elbow. And in those walks, we talked. Not about the past, not yet, but about books, favorite flowers, the names of the neighborhood cats. I laughed again. Smiled again. And, bit by bit, I began to believe something dangerous and beautiful. That maybe I deserved to survive. It wasn't just about the hospital. The truth is, I'd been fading out of their focus long before the diagnosis. Growing up, it always felt like Isabel and I were born into two different familias, except we lived under the same roof. She got ballet lessons, new dresses, birthday parties with themes. I got leftover decorations and hand-me-downs 2 sizes too big. She was the daughter they talked about at church, bragged about to friends, plastered on the Christmas card. I was the one they left out of photo captions or introduced as the quiet one. At first, I tried harder. I brought home straight A's, volunteered at school events, joined the library club. But no matter how well I did, the response was the same. "That's great, Madeline. Now can you help Isabel with her math homework?" It was like I didn't exist unless I was useful. I remember one time, I think I was 12, when I got second place in the state spelling bee. I was so proud. I even brought the little silver medal to dinner, thinking maybe this would be it. Maybe they'd finally look at me. But instead, Mom barely glanced up and said, "Could you not wear that at the table, sweetie? It's distracting." That night, I tucked the medal into the back of my drawer and never mentioned it again. It wasn't that they hated me. That would have been easier to understand. It was that they didn't see me at all. And when I got sick, they didn't suddenly wake up and realize what they were about to lose. They just stayed asleep. The day after I moved in with Grandma, I saw Isabel's college announcement on social media. Big smiles, balloons, a caption that said, "So proud of our girl. Can't wait to see the amazing things she'll do." There was no mention of me, no concern, no acknowledgement that I was fighting for my life across town. That post broke something inside me. Not because I expected them to care, but because a part of me still wanted them to. Even after everything, I still hoped for a call, a message, some sign that maybe they regretted walking out. But none came. Instead, my parents doubled down on their narrative. Isabel was the shining future. I was the shadow that chose to disappear. It was easier for them to believe I ran away out of rebellion, not desperation. It gave them clean hands and a clear conscience. But I remembered. I remembered every moment, the way they looked at me in that hospital room, like I was a number, not a daughter. And slowly, a new kind of resolve began to build inside me. I wasn't going to chase their love anymore. I was going to outgrow the box they built for me. And when the time came, they would see me. Not because I asked to be seen, but because I'd become someone they couldn't ignore. Healing wasn't linear. There were days when I felt strong enough to walk to the end of the street and back. There were days when I couldn't sit up without seeing stars. But Grandma never rushed me. She treated my recovery like tending a garden, gently, patiently, watering me with small acts of kindness until I could stand on my own. She bought a little whiteboard and wrote notes on it each morning. "You're doing great. Breakfast is ready when you are. Today's goal? Smile once." And slowly, the knots in my chest began to loosen. I started helping with things around the house, folding laundry, chopping vegetables, reading aloud while she knitted. It wasn't much, but it was something. Then, one day, I asked, "Can I help with bills?" Grandma looked at me like I'd grown a second head. "Absolutely not. Your job right now is healing." Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to give something back. So I started tutoring online. Just 1 or 2 students. Then 4. Then 7. Math, mostly. Some English. The kids were sweet, awkward, eager. One girl told me, "You explain things better than my teacher." I smiled for an hour after that. It wasn't just about the money, though. It helped us pay for a few extra prescriptions without worry. It was about feeling useful. Like I was slowly becoming someone who could build instead of break. Grandma noticed. One evening over soup, she said, "I think you're more yourself now than I've ever seen you." I paused, spoon halfway to my mouth. "What do you mean?" She tilted her head thoughtfully. "Your parents always saw you as background. But you were never background, Madeline. You just needed a place to grow where no one was standing in your light." That stuck with me. All my life, I'd tried to shrink. Make room for Isabel. Make peace with silence. Make excuses for being invisible. But now, in this little yellow house, I didn't have to disappear. And something new was taking root inside me. Not revenge. Not even anger. But clarity. I knew exactly what my parents thought of me, and I was finally done trying to change their minds. What I wanted wasn't an apology, it was truth. I wanted them to be seen for who they really were, by the people who still believed in their perfect facade. Because while they'd left me to die and moved on with their smiling social media posts and scholarship bragging, they had no idea. I was building something of my own, something strong, something real. And one day, the truth would reach the ears they cared about most. And when it did, they'd feel the weight of what they'd thrown away. Not through rage, not through fire, but through something colder. Consequence. By the time winter came, I was stronger. I could walk a mile without stopping. I could laugh without feeling guilty. I could sleep through the night without waking up in a panic. And I was earning enough through tutoring that Grandma finally stopped pretending she didn't need help with groceries. We were okay. More than okay, actually. Some nights we'd drink peppermint tea and watch cooking shows in our pajamas, pausing every 10 minutes to debate whether or not we could recreate the dish. We couldn't. We had routines, warmth, safety. We had something that felt suspiciously like a real life. But underneath that peace, something else was quietly taking shape. I hadn't forgotten. Not the hospital room. Not the way my mother said, "We just can't afford it." Not the way my father refused to look at me when he walked out. They had gone on with their lives, kept their business running, kept telling their carefully curated story to the world that they were a loving family, that they'd made sacrifices, that they stood for integrity and excellence. And I had proof that it was all a lie. One afternoon, while sorting through old files on my phone, I came across a screenshot I'd forgotten. I'd taken a text from my mother to Isabel, saying, "Don't worry about your sister, she'll come home when she stops being dramatic." Another message from my father read, "We can't throw away Isabel's future on a maybe. Maitland's strong, she'll figure it out." They hadn't left me because they had no choice. They'd left me because they didn't want to choose me. And the more I thought about it, the more one name came back to me. Eleanor Stratton, director of the Stratton Scholars Network, former dean of admissions, founder of a selective scholarship foundation that my parents had been bragging about for years. They called her our golden contact. They invited her to dinners, sent her glowing updates about Isabel's achievements, positioned her as the linchpin to Isabel's elite future. She was their idol, their validator, the one person whose opinion they truly cared about. And I wondered, did she know the truth? Did she know that the same people who called themselves champions of education left their own daughter in a hospital bed to die? I didn't want to scream. I didn't want a viral takedown or a Facebook rant. I just wanted Eleanor Stratton to know exactly who she was aligning herself with. So, one evening, while Grandma made banana bread in the kitchen, I sat down at the old desktop and opened a blank email. I wrote simply, factually, no drama, no embellishment. I told her what happened. I told her I was the daughter of Mark and Catherine Carter, that I had once needed urgent medical treatment, that they refused to pay for it because the money had already been set aside for my sister Isabel's college tuition. I told her I survived because someone else, me grandmother, stepped in. And I attached proof. The hospital letter showing denial of care due to lack of payment. Screenshots of the texts. A statement from the social worker who filed the neglect report. At the end, I wrote only one sentence. I thought you might want to know what kind of people you're endorsing. I didn't sign it with bitterness. Just my name. Maitland Carter. I read it 3 times. Then, I clicked send. And in the stillness that followed, I realized I didn't feel guilty. I felt ready. I didn't hear back from Eleanor Stratton. I didn't expect to. But 2 weeks later, the badge on my parents' website, proud partner of the Stratton Scholars Network, was gone. It had always been front and center, highlighted in gold. They used to boast about it in every brochure, every pitch to high-paying clients. Now, just vanished. I checked the foundation's directory. Their names had been quietly removed. No announcement, no explanation. Just one clean, silent severing. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding not from fear, but from something colder, steadier. It had begun. What followed wasn't loud. It didn't make headlines or cause a public scandal. It was quieter, more surgical. First, a few client reviews disappeared from their website. Then a school pulled out of a scheduled speaking engagement. Then another declined to renew their consulting contract. Whispers began to circulate in the tight-knit academic community. Parents who had once trusted them with their children's futures began to ask quiet questions. Was it true? Had they really abandoned their own daughter? Had they covered it up? My parents tried to pivot fast. They changed their branding, launched a new package series, rewrote their bios to center Isabel's recent awards. But it didn't work. The phone stopped ringing. Emails went unanswered. Their monthly newsletter, once boasting upcoming college seminars and glowing testimonials, now sat unopened in inboxes. Then came the big collapse. 3 major contracts pulled out in a single week. They tried to sue, but it only made things worse. More attention, more questions. I didn't celebrate. I didn't post about it. I didn't tell Grandma. I just watched. And remembered. 6 months after I'd sent the email, I saw a local real estate listing. Office space for lease formerly occupied by Carter Academic Strategies. The address matched theirs. They had shut down. According to a forum thread, they'd moved operations into their home, then lost that too. A few weeks later, I saw my parents in person. It was at a youth mentorship conference I'd been invited to speak at. I had just wrapped up a panel about resilience, standing alongside educators and social workers from across the state. As I stepped off the stage, I saw them near the exit. My mother looked older, her makeup uneven, like she hadn't worn it in a while. My father's suit hung loose at the shoulders, his shoes scuffed and tired. They looked small. "Madeline," my mom said, her voice cracking. "Please, just a minute." I froze. "We know we messed up," Dad said. "We've lost everything." I stood still, arms folded. They looked nervous, like they didn't know how to speak to me anymore. "We saw the foundation cut us off," Mom continued. "We saw your name on the mentorship panel. We didn't realize how far you'd come. We didn't know you'd survive?" I asked. She flinched. "We were scared," she whispered. "We didn't know what to do." "No," I said coldly. "You knew exactly what to do, and you chose not to." Dad stepped forward. "We're not asking for much, just some help. Things aren't good. We're struggling." I tilted my head. "When I was in the hospital, you said you couldn't afford to save my life." They were silent. I smiled, not cruelly, but truthfully. "I'm just returning the favor." And then I walked past them steady, calm, and didn't look back. That night, I went home to Grandma. We had tea on the porch while the wind rustled the trees around us. She didn't ask how it went. She just poured me a cup and handed me a blanket. I looked out into the night and whispered, "They tried to erase me." Grandma reached over and squeezed my hand. "They failed," she said. And in the stillness, I finally believed her. Life didn't suddenly become perfect after that. There were still tough days, doctor checkups, old memories that tugged at me in the dark, nightmares I couldn't always explain. But the difference was, I didn't carry them alone. Grandma Rosemary stood by me through it all. She didn't fix me. She didn't try to erase the pain. She just stayed. And that was enough. My tutoring work grew. I expanded to help kids who came from homes like mine where silence replaced support, where love was conditional and expensive. I started a scholarship fund in my name, not in spite, in protection, to make sure no child would be forced to choose between life and someone else's ambition. I didn't speak of my parents again, not to the students I mentored, not to the families I worked with. I wasn't interested in revenge. I was interested in rebuilding, one brick at a time. On Grandma's birthday, I surprised her with something I'd been planning for months: a small white house near a lake, with a reading room full of windows and a kitchen big enough for two. She cried so hard she couldn't speak. And I did what she'd done for me all those months ago. I held her hand and whispered, "You're not alone." Later that night, we sat under the stars, wrapped in blankets, sipping tea. "If you could go anywhere next," I asked, "where would it be?" She smiled. "Somewhere warm, with a hammock, and no clocks." I grinned. "Let's book it." She looked at Minnow as someone she rescued, but someone she trusted. And in that moment, I realized something simple and profound. I hadn't just survived. I had chosen who to become. Not for their approval. Not for their forgiveness. But for me. And for the one person who saw me before I even knew I was worth seeing,